Some wounds never heal the way they should. Some carry secrets that were meant to stay buried. Ranch hand Levi Harlan learned this the hard way when a simple scrape from barbed wire turned into something no doctor wanted to explain. The circular lesions appeared within days, dark and perfectly round, spreading across his skin like brands. When old Doc Morrison saw them, his face went white. He'd seen those marks before, back when the government paid him to keep quiet about things that happened in the hills. Now Levi's body is changing in ways that shouldn't be possible. What really happened at that abandoned military site? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Harlan ranch as Levi adjusted his worn leather gloves and checked the cinch on his saddle one more time. At 35, he'd been working cattle since he could barely reach the stirrups, and every sunrise brought the same familiar rhythm: feed the horses, check the fences, move the herd. It was honest work that kept a man grounded, the kind his grandfather had done and his father still did, though age was slowing the old man down considerably. "You heading up to the north pasture today?" His father, Jim Harlan, called from the porch of their weathered farmhouse. At 68, Jim still carried himself with the straight-back dignity of a lifelong rancher, though his hand shook slightly when he thought no one was looking. "That's the plan," Levi replied, swinging up into the saddle with the easy grace of decades of practice. "Chuck and Miguel are meeting me up there. We need to move those steers before the weather turns." The Wyoming sky stretched endlessly above them, painted in shades of blue that city folks never quite understood. Out here, a man could think clearly, could feel connected to something larger than himself. The land had been in their family for 3 generations, carved out of wilderness by his great-grandfather with nothing but determination and a stubborn refusal to quit when times got hard. Chuck Brennan was already waiting at the gate when Levi arrived, his bay horse dancing impatiently beneath him. At 42, Chuck had worked alongside Levi for nearly 15 years, and their partnership had the easy efficiency of old friends who rarely needed words to communicate their intentions. "Morning, Levi. You see those clouds building to the west?" Chuck nodded toward the horizon where dark thunderheads were beginning to gather. "Might want to get this done before that storm hits." Miguel Herrera joined them moments later, his young face serious with concentration. At 26, he was the newest member of their small crew, but he had good instincts and wasn't afraid of hard work. His grandfather had been a vaquero in Mexico, and some of that old-world horsemanship seemed to flow through his veins. The 3 men rode out across the rolling hills, their horses' hooves drumming a steady rhythm against the packed earth. The north pasture stretched for miles, dotted with clusters of black Angus cattle that needed to be moved to lower ground before the approaching storm made the work dangerous. "Remember when we used to do this with your dad and old Pete Morrison?" Chuck asked as they crested a small ridge. "Seems like yesterday, but that had to be 20 years ago." Levi nodded, remembering those long days when his father's back was still strong and Pete Morrison, Doc Morrison's younger brother, hadn't yet been claimed by the cancer that took him too early. The ranching community was small, and every loss was felt deeply by those who remained. The work began in earnest as they spread out to gather the scattered herd. Levi guided his horse, Ranger, through a stand of scrub oak where several steers had wandered, their black coats gleaming in the morning light. It was routine work, the kind he could do in his sleep, but it required constant attention. Cattle were unpredictable creatures, and a moment's inattention could result in injury or lost livestock. That's when it happened. A simple mistake that would change everything. One of the younger steers, spooked by something in the underbrush, bolted suddenly toward a section of old fence line. Levi spurred Ranger forward to cut off the animal's escape route, but the steer was faster than expected. As Levi leaned low in the saddle to grab the wayward animal, his left leg scraped against a section of rusted barbed wire that had broken loose from its post. The wire caught his jeans and tore through the fabric, leaving a jagged scratch along his shin. Blood seeped through the denim, but it wasn't deep. Just another occupational hazard in a job filled with them. Levi had been cut, kicked, thrown, and bruised more times than he could count. This was nothing. "You all right over there?" Chuck called out, having noticed a brief scuffle. "Just a scratch," Levi replied, not bothering to examine the wound closely. "Nothing a bandage won't fix." They continued working through the morning, moving the herd toward the lower pastures with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this countless times before. The approaching storm lent urgency to their efforts, and by noon they had successfully relocated the cattle to safer ground. As they rode back toward the ranch house, Miguel noticed the tear in Levi's jeans and the dried blood on the fabric. "That looks like it might need stitches, amigo." Levi glanced down at his leg, where the wound had stopped bleeding but left a dark stain on his jeans. "It's nothing serious. I'll clean it up when we get back." But Chuck, who'd raised 3 sons and knew something about injuries, wasn't convinced. "When's the last time you had a tetanus shot?" "That wire looked pretty rusty." "Few years back, maybe more," Levi admitted. "But I'm not worried about it." The conversation turned to other matters as they unsaddled their horses and turned them out to pasture. Chuck had to pick up his daughter from school, and Miguel was meeting his girlfriend in town. It was Friday afternoon, and the weekend stretched ahead with the promise of rest and time spent with family. Levi walked slowly toward the house, his leg beginning to throb now that the adrenaline of the day's work had faded. His father was sitting on the porch, reading a farming magazine and drinking coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. "How'd it go up there?" Jim asked, looking up from his magazine. "Got them moved before the storm hits. Had a little scrape with some barbed wire, but nothing serious." Jim's eyes narrowed as he noticed the torn jeans and bloodstain. "You might want to have Doc Morrison take a look at that. Rusty wire can be nasty business." "It's just a scratch, Dad. I've had worse." But even as he said the words, Levi felt a nagging unease he couldn't quite explain. The wound seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and when he touched the area gently, it felt warmer than it should have. He dismissed the feeling as his imagination. After all, injuries always felt worse when you started thinking about them. That evening, after a hot shower and a hearty dinner of pot roast and potatoes, Levi finally took a proper look at the wound. He sat on the edge of his bed, rolling up his jeans to expose the injury. What he saw made him frown. The scratch itself wasn't particularly impressive, maybe 4 inches long and not very deep. But the skin around it had an odd, mottled appearance, almost like a bruise, but with a strange, circular pattern. The wound itself seemed clean enough, though the edges had a slightly raised appearance that hadn't been there that morning. He cleaned the area with rubbing alcohol, wincing at the sharp sting, and applied a bandage. Probably just the beginning of the healing process, he reasoned. Bodies did strange things sometimes when they were mending themselves, but as he lay in bed that night, listening to the storm that had finally arrived drumming against his window, Levi couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The wound throbbed with a persistent ache that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, and more than once he found himself unconsciously scratching at the bandage. Outside, lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, momentary detail, and thunder rolled across the hills like the sound of distant artillery. In the brief flashes of light, Levi could see the abandoned military facility that sat on the ridge about 5 miles north of their property. A cluster of concrete buildings that had been empty for as long as he could remember. His father had always been vague about what had gone on up there, saying only that it was some kind of government research station that had been shut down back in the 80s. Most of the locals avoided the area, not out of any particular fear, but simply because there was nothing there worth visiting. As sleep finally claimed him, Levi's dreams were filled with strange images, circular patterns that seemed to move and shift, the taste of metal in his mouth, and the persistent feeling that something was watching him from the darkness. He woke several times during the night, each time touching the bandage on his leg and finding it warm to the touch. Morning would bring the first real sign that this was no ordinary wound, and that some secrets, once buried, have a way of clawing their way back to the surface. But for now, Levi slept fitfully, unaware that his life had already begun to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The storm passed before dawn, leaving the air clean and fresh, but the sense of unease that had settled over the ranch house seemed to linger like morning fog. Something had been set in motion by that encounter with rusty wire, something that connected the present to a past that certain people had worked very hard to forget. In his office in town, Doc Morrison sat at his desk, staring at a leather-bound journal he hadn't opened in more than 20 years. Inside its pages were sketches and notes that the government had paid him handsomely to never discuss with anyone. But lately, he'd been having dreams about those old cases, dreams that left him waking in a cold sweat with the taste of fear in his mouth. He didn't know it yet, but very soon he would have to confront the ghosts of decisions he'd made long ago, when he was a younger man who thought he understood the difference between right and wrong. The journal contained secrets that certain people had died to protect, and others had killed to keep hidden. But secrets, like wounds, have a way of refusing to heal cleanly, and some marks, once made, can never truly be erased. 3 days after the accident, Levi knew something was seriously wrong. He stood in his bathroom, morning light streaming through the small window as he carefully peeled back the bandage on his leg. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The original scratch had changed completely. Instead of the healing wound he expected, there were now 3 distinct circular lesions, each about the size of a quarter, arranged in a perfect triangle around the site of the original injury. The circles were dark, almost black, with raised edges that felt hard to the touch. They didn't hurt exactly, but they radiated a strange warmth that seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. Most unsettling of all, they looked deliberate, as if they'd been carefully placed there by some precise instrument. "Dad," he called out, his voice carrying an edge of concern he couldn't hide. "I think I need to see Doc Morrison." Jim Harlan appeared in the doorway, took one look at his son's leg, and his face went pale. For a moment, the old rancher said nothing, just stared at the strange marks with an expression that mixed fear with something that looked almost like recognition. "Get dressed," Jim said quietly. "We're going to town. Now." The drive to Millbrook took 25 minutes on a good day, but Jim pushed his old Ford harder than usual, gravel spraying behind them as they navigated the winding county roads. He kept glancing at Levi with worried eyes, but when his son asked what was wrong, Jim just shook his head and pressed harder on the accelerator. Doc Morrison's clinic sat on Main Street between the hardware store and Sally's Diner, a modest brick building that had served the community's medical needs for over 30 years. Morrison himself was nearing 70, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that still moved with the precision of a surgeon, though he'd given up major procedures years ago. The waiting room was empty when they arrived, which wasn't unusual for a Tuesday morning. The receptionist, Mrs. Patterson, looked up from her paperwork with a smile that faded when she saw the grim expressions on both men's faces. "Is the doc available?" Jim asked. "It's urgent." Within minutes, they were ushered into Morrison's examination room. The doctor greeted them with professional warmth, but Levi noticed how his eyes immediately went to the torn spot in his jeans where the bandage showed through. "Let's have a look at what we're dealing with," Morrison said, his voice steady but with an undertone that suggested he was working to keep it that way. Levi rolled up his jeans and removed the bandage. The moment Doc Morrison saw the circular lesions, his demeanor changed completely. The color drained from his face, and his hands began to tremble slightly as he reached for his examination gloves. "Where did you say this happened?" Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "North pasture. Scraped it on some old barbed wire," Levi replied. "Doc, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." Morrison didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took out a magnifying glass and examined the lesions closely, occasionally making soft sounds of distress under his breath. Finally, he straightened up and removed his gloves with hands that were now visibly shaking. "I need to check something," he said, moving toward a file cabinet in the corner of the room. "Don't move. Either of you." He pulled out a key and opened the bottom drawer, removing a leather-bound journal that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. As he flipped through the pages, Levi could see sketches and notes, but couldn't make out the details from them. Where he sat, Morrison found what he was looking for and held the journal up next to Levi's leg. The resemblance was unmistakable. The circular lesions in the sketch were identical to the ones on Levi's skin. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered. "It's happening again." "What's happening again?" Levi demanded. "Doc, you're scaring me." Morrison set the journal aside and walked to his desk, where he pulled out a manila folder that looked official, the kind with government seals and classification stamps. Inside was a single document, partially destroyed, with portions blacked out by heavy marker. "This is from 1984, Morrison said, his voice hollow. "Medical file number 347B. The classification was supposed to keep it buried forever." He handed the document to Levi, who read the visible portions with growing alarm. The file described a biological marker system developed as part of something called Project Sentinel. Most of the technical details were either redacted or destroyed, but several phrases stood out clearly: human test subjects, tracking protocol, and most chilling of all, collection procedures. "Doc," Jim Harlan said quietly, and both men turned to look at him. "You need to tell us everything." Morrison sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. "I was young then, fresh out of medical school, idealistic. They came to me in 1983, said they needed a local physician to help with a research project. Good pay, they said. Important for national security." He gestured toward the abandoned facility visible through his office window. "That place up on the ridge, it wasn't empty back then. Full of scientists and military personnel, working on things I wasn't supposed to ask questions about. My job was simple: examine test subjects, document any reactions, keep detailed records." "Test subjects?" Levi asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "Local people, ranchers mostly, men who worked near the facility who might have come into contact with contaminated materials." Morrison's voice was barely audible now. "They told us it was preventive medicine, that we were protecting the community from potential exposure to hazardous materials. But it wasn't," Jim said. "It wasn't a question. No, it was something else entirely. They were marking people, tracking them. The lesions, they're not just skin conditions. They're living organisms engineered to integrate with human tissue and broadcast a biological signature." Levi stared at the marks on his leg with new horror. "You mean these things are alive?" "I don't know exactly what they are," Morrison admitted. "The science was beyond my understanding. But I know what happens to people who develop them. They get collected." "Collected?" Morrison pulled out another file, this one containing photographs. Black and white images of men with similar lesions, along with what looked like intake forms. Names, dates, and at the bottom of each form, a stamp. That read, "Collection complete." Every 6 months or so, they would come for the marked ones. Take them away for advanced treatment. they said. None of them ever came back to town. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, Levi found his voice. How many people? Over the years? Maybe 24. The project was supposed to end in 1985 after some kind of incident. But the markings, they kept appearing occasionally. People who worked near contaminated equipment or came into contact with materials that had been buried but weren't properly contained. Like rusted barbed wire, Jim said grimly. Morrison nodded. The contamination spread slowly through groundwater, soil contact. Most of it degrades over time, but some materials retain their potency for decades. Levi looked at his father, seeing his own fear reflected in the older man's eyes. What happened to the others? The ones who were collected? I don't know, Morrison said. Officially, they were relocated for their own safety. Unofficially, ... He shrugged helplessly. I stopped asking questions after the first few disappeared. They paid me well to keep quiet, and I convinced myself I was protecting the community by monitoring the situation. But you kept records, Levi said, gesturing to the journal and files. Insurance, Morrison replied. I always suspected that someday I might need proof of what really happened here. I just never thought. He looked at Levi's leg again and shook his head. I never thought it would start again. Jim Harlan stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. The project ended 40 years ago. Why is this happening now? Maybe it never really ended, Morrison said quietly. Maybe they just got better at hiding it. Outside, a black sedan with government plates drove slowly past the clinic, its tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun. All three men watched it pass, and Morrison's face went even paler. They're still watching, he whispered. After all, these years, they're still watching. Levi felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The lesions on his legs seemed to pulse more strongly now, as if responding to his elevated heart rate. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice was telling him to run, to get as far away as possible before it was too late. But another part of him, the part that came from generations of stubborn ranchers, who didn't back down from a fight wanted answers. If people had disappeared because of whatever was in his bloodstream now, he was going to find out what happened to them. Doc, he said, his voice stronger than he felt. I need to know everything. Every detail you can remember about that place. About the project, about what they were really doing up there. Morrison looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then we'd better get started. Because if history is any guide, we don't have much time. That evening, Levi sat in the county clerk's office just before closing time, poring over property records and geological surveys from the 1980s. Morrison's revelations had lit a fire under him. If the government had been running secret experiments on local people, there had to be a paper trail somewhere. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Betty Holloway, who'd worked there for 25 years, was initially helpful but grew increasingly nervous as Levi's requests became more specific. I'm looking for anything related to the military facility north of town, he explained. Property transfers, environmental surveys, construction permits, anything from around 1983 to 1985. Betty disappeared into the back room and returned with a dusty box labeled Federal Properties Archived. As she set it on the table, she glanced around nervously. Most of this stuff is public record, she said quietly. But some folks get upset when people start digging around in old government business. You understand? Levi understood perfectly. In a small town, word traveled fast in certain subjects were better left alone if you wanted to keep living there peacefully. Among the documents, he found what he was looking for, a surveyor's map from 1983, far more detailed than anything he'd seen before. The official records showed the facility as a simple research station, but this survey map revealed something much more complex. The surface buildings were just the beginning. According to the survey, There was an extensive underground complex with multiple levels extending deep into the hillside. Ventilation shafts, emergency exits, and what appeared to be containment areas were marked throughout the subterranean sections. Most interesting were the notations around the perimeter, areas marked with warnings about biological containment zones and contaminated material storage. The map showed these zones extending well beyond the facility's official boundaries, including areas that now encompassed parts of several local ranches, including his own family's property. "Betty," he said, keeping his voice casual, "do you know if there were ever any environmental cleanup efforts up at that facility?" She shook her head quickly. "Not that I ever heard of. When they shut it down in '85, they just locked the gates and walked away. Always struck me as odd, especially after." She stopped herself mid-sentence. "After what?" Betty looked around again, then leaned closer. "After Jake Whitmore started having those problems. You know, Jake runs cattle up near Pine Ridge." Levi knew Jake well. He was one of the older ranchers in the area, a tough man who'd worked the land for 50 years. What kind of problems? His cattle started getting sick in late '84, early '85. Strange symptoms, lesions on their skin, behavioral changes. Jake wanted the state to investigate, but then suddenly he stopped talking about it. Sold off his whole herd and never raised cattle again. The pieces were starting to come together. If the contamination had affected livestock, it made sense. That it could affect humans too, especially those working closely with the land. "Is Jake still around?" "Oh yes, he's still up at his place. Keeps to himself mostly these days. Grows vegetables now, sells them at the farmer's market on Saturdays." Levi made a mental note to visit Jake as soon as possible. If anyone would remember the details from that time period, it would be one of the old-timers who'd been directly affected. As he prepared to leave the clerk's office, Betty touched his arm gently. "Levi, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but there was a man in here last week asking about the same kinds of records. Government type, if you know what I mean. He was particularly interested in current property ownership around the old facility." A chill ran down Levi's spine. "Did he give a name?" "Said he was with the EPA, doing some kind of follow-up study. But he didn't look like any environmental scientist I've ever seen. More like," she shrugged, "like the kind of men who used to come around during the project years." Levi thanked her and drove home with his mind racing. A surveyor's map was rolled up on the passenger seat beside him, a piece of evidence that raised more questions than it answered. The scope of the underground facility was far larger than anyone in town had realized, and the contamination zones covered thousands of acres out back at the ranch. He found his father sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring out at the hills where the abandoned facility sat in the distance. "Find anything useful?" Jim asked. Levi unrolled the map on the porch table, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs. "More than I expected. Dad, look at this." Jim studied the survey map, his expression growing more troubled with each passing moment. When he saw the contamination zones, he pointed to an area that clearly included their north pasture. "That's where you got hurt," he said quietly, "right in the middle of what they marked as a biological containment area." Betty Holloway mentioned, "Jake Whitmore had problems with his cattle back in the '80s. You remember anything about that?" Jim nodded slowly. "Jake lost his whole herd to some kind of disease. State veterinarian came out to investigate. Then suddenly, the whole thing got hushed up. Jake never talked about it afterward, but I could tell it shook him up pretty bad. I'm going to see him tomorrow." "Levi," his father said, his voice carrying a note of warning, "you need to be careful who you trust with this. If what Doc Morrison told us is true, there are people who've killed to keep these secrets buried." As if to underscore his father's point, they both noticed a dark SUV parked on the county road about a quarter-mile away, positioned where it had a clear view of their house. and hadn't been there when Levi returned from town. "How long has that vehicle been there?" Levi asked. "About 10 minutes after you got home." They watched the SUV for several more minutes, but it didn't move. Finally, Levi got up and walked toward his truck, curious to see what the occupants would do. As soon as he started the engine, the SUV pulled away, disappearing over the hill toward town. "They're watching us," Jim said when Levi returned to the porch. "Then we need to be smart about this. If they're monitoring our movements, we have to assume they know I've been asking questions." That night, Levi lay in bed studying the survey, map by lamplight, tracing the underground passages with his finger and trying to understand the full scope of what had been built beneath the Wyoming hills. The lesions on his legs seemed more active now, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat and generating enough heat that he could feel it through his pajamas. He was beginning to understand that time was running out. If Morrison was right about the collection pattern, he might have only days or weeks before whoever was behind this decided he knew too much to remain free. But the map had given him something valuable, a blueprint of the facility that might hold the answers he needed. The underground complex was extensive enough that there might be records still there, evidence that could expose the whole conspiracy. The question was whether he could get inside without alerting the people, who were clearly keeping the place under surveillance, and whether he could find what he needed before the changes in his body progressed beyond the point of no return. Outside his window, another set of headlights moved slowly along the county road, pausing briefly before continuing into the darkness. The watchers were still there, patient and persistent, waiting for him to make his next move. Jake Whitmore's place sat at the end of a winding dirt road that hadn't seen greater maintenance in years. The old rancher's property was a stark contrast to the cattle operations that dominated the area instead of pastures. There were neat rows of vegetable gardens and a collection of greenhouses that looked surprisingly modern compared to the weathered farmhouse. Levi found Jake working in his tomato patch, a lean man in his 70s with the kind of deep tan that came from a lifetime outdoors. When Jake looked up and saw who was approaching, his expression shifted from polite curiosity to something approaching alarm. "Levi Harlan," Jake said, straightening slowly and wiping his hands on a faded work shirt. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Need to ask you some questions about the old days, Jake. About what happened to your cattle in the 80s. Jake's face went stone-cold serious. "That's ancient history, son. Nothing good comes from digging up old troubles." "I'm afraid it's not so ancient." Levi rolled up his jeans to show the circular lesions on his leg. "Doc Morrison says these are the same marks that appeared on people back during the project years." The older man stared at the marks for a long moment, and Levi could see decades of suppressed memories playing across his weathered features. Finally, Jake set down his gardening tools and gestured toward the house. "We better talk inside. And keep your voice down. Sound carries further than you might think out here." Jake's kitchen was sparse but clean, decorated with photographs of cattle and horses from better times. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if Levi wanted any, then sat across from him at a small wooden table. "I haven't talked about this in 30 years, Jake began quietly. "After what happened, men in suits made it very clear that my memory problems about that time period would be in everyone's best interest. What exactly happened to your cattle?" Jake got up and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a small wooden box that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Inside were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be veterinary records. "Started in October of 1984, he said, spreading the materials on the table. 3 of my best breeding cows developed these strange lesions. Circular marks, just like what you've got there. Within a week, it had spread to half the herd. The photographs were disturbing cattle with multiple circular marks covering their hides, their eyes dull and lifeless. But what caught Leva's attention was a manila envelope marked "Property of T. Garrett" in faded ink. Who was T. Garrett? Levi asked. Jake's expression darkened further. Tommy Garrett. Had a small spread about 5 miles east of here, right up against the boundary of that government facility. Good man, hard worker. He was the first to notice the problems with his livestock. What happened to him? That's what I've been wondering for 30 years. Jake opened the envelope carefully, revealing more photographs and what looked like diary entries written in a careful hand. Tommy came to see me in November of '84, said his animals were dying, and he was starting to develop the same symptoms they had. Levi studied the diary entries. Tommy's handwriting started out neat and controlled, but as the entries progressed, it became increasingly erratic. November 15th. The marks are spreading. Doc Morrison won't return my calls. November 18th. Someone was watching the house last night. Saw lights in the hills. November 22nd. There are my dreams now. The circular patterns, they move, they pulse. I can feel them under my skin. November 25th. Can't sleep. Keep thinking someone's coming for me. Maybe I should run. November 27th. 2. Late to run. They know where I am. They've always known. The final entry was dated November 30th, 1984. If anyone finds this, the truth is in the cellar. Behind the furnace, under the loose floorboards. Don't let them bury it again. Jake noticed Levi's intense focus on the diary. Tommy disappeared. That same night, his truck was found abandoned on Highway 287, but nobody ever saw him again. The official story was that he'd had some kind of breakdown, wandered off into the wilderness, but you don't believe that. I know what I saw. 3 days after Tommy vanished, men in hazmat suits showed up at his property, spent a week there, sealed off the whole area. When they left, they bulldozed the house and buried everything under 10 feet of dirt. Levi felt his pulse quicken. Is the property still there? Far as I know. It's been empty land ever since. Officially, the county condemned it as environmentally hazardous, but I've never seen any cleanup crews or environmental testing. Jake reached into the box again and pulled out a hand-drawn map. Tommy gave me this the last time I saw him. Shows the location of his old cellar in case something happened to him. The map was crude but detailed enough to follow, showing landmarks and distances from recognizable points. If Tommy had hidden evidence in his cellar, and if the government bulldozers had missed it, there might be answers waiting to be found. Jake, I need to see that cellar. The old rancher shook his head firmly. Son, I've kept quiet about this for 30 years because I wanted to stay alive. Tommy Garrett was a good man, and whatever he found got him killed or worse. But people are still disappearing, aren't they? The project never really ended. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photographs of his dead cattle. There have been incidents over the years. A drifter here, a seasonal worker there. People who wouldn't be missed immediately. But nothing as organized as what happened. In the 80s, until now. Until now, Jake agreed reluctantly. The lesions you're showing, that's exactly how it started with Tommy. First the marks, then the dreams, then the feeling of being watched. Levi felt a chill of recognition. He'd been having strange dreams since the marks appeared, vivid nightmares, filled with circular patterns and the sense of something vast and malevolent observing him. What else did Tommy tell you? Anything about what he thought was really happening up at that facility? Jake hesitated, then reached for another document from the box. He brought me this about a week before he disappeared. Said he'd found it, buried near his property line. It was a fragment of an official document, water-damaged and partially illegible, but several phrases were still visible. Biological tracking system, human integration protocol, and most chilling of all, collection. Schedule Phase 2. Phase 2? Levi asked. That's what scared Tommy the most. He thought Phase 1 was the initial experiments in the 80s, but Phase 2 was supposed to be something bigger. Long-term monitoring of marked subjects, gradual expansion of the contaminated areas. Expansion? Jake nodded grimly. Think about it, son. That barbed wire you scraped yourself on, where did it come from originally? How did contaminated materials end up scattered around local ranches 30 years after the project officially ended? The implication hit Levi like a physical blow. The contamination hadn't been contained. It had been deliberately spread, seeded, throughout the area so that new subjects would be marked periodically, providing a steady supply for whatever the project's true purpose was. They're farming us, he said quietly. That's what Tommy thought, and I think he was right. Jake began gathering up the documents and photographs, handling them with the care of a man who understood their deadly significance. If you're determined to find that cellar, you need to be smarter than Tommy was. Don't go alone, don't go during daylight, and for God's sake, don't trust anyone in an official capacity. What about Doc Morrison? He's been helping. Morrison's been keeping their secrets for 30 years. Jake interrupted. Maybe he feels guilty now. Maybe he wants to make amends. But he's already proven he'll choose self-preservation over doing the right thing when the pressure's on. Levi thought about the black sedan that had passed Morrison's clinic, the way the doctor's hands had shaken when he saw the lesions. Jake was right. Morrison was scared, and scared men made unpredictable allies. There's something else you need to know, Jake said as he walked Levi to the door. The marks on your skin, they're not just tracking devices. According to what Tommy found, they changed the host's biology over time. Enhanced senses, increased strength, altered brain chemistry. Enhanced. How? Better night vision, improved hearing, faster reflexes. The government wasn't just tracking people. They were creating them. Super soldiers, maybe, or something even worse. As Levi drove away from Jake's property, his mind was reeling with the implications of what he'd learned. The personal effects. Box, now sitting in his truck, contained evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond a simple cover-up. People hadn't just been disappeared. They'd been harvested, transformed, used for purposes he was only beginning to understand. The lesions on his leg pulsed with increasing intensity, and he realized that his hearing had indeed become sharper over the past few days. Sounds that should have been background noise, the engine's subtle variations, the crunch of gravel under his tires, even his own heartbeat were crystal clear and distinct. Whatever was happening to his body was accelerating, and he was running. Out of time to find answers before he either disappeared like Tommy Garrett or became something he no longer recognized as human. The cellar marked on. Tommy's map represented his best hope of understanding the full scope of the conspiracy. But getting there would require careful planning. The watchers were still out there, patient and persistent, waiting for him to make a mistake that would give them the excuse they needed to bring him in for collection. As he turned onto the county road that would take him home, Levi noticed the same dark SUV from the night before parked near a grove of cottonwood trees about a half-mile behind him. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. The game was accelerating, and the stakes were becoming clear. Find the truth, or become another missing person whose disappearance would be explained away with lies and bureaucratic double-talk. But as he drove through the gathering dusk, Levi felt something new stirring within him, not just fear or determination, but a predatory awareness that seemed to come from the same source as his enhanced senses. Whatever these marks were doing to his body, they were awakening capabilities he'd never possessed. Maybe the hunters were about to discover they'd marked the wrong prey. Finding Dr. Elena Vasquez took 3 days of careful investigation and more computer research than Levi had done in his entire life. Her name appeared in a footnote of a declassified document he'd found in an online database of government contractors. From the 1980s, listed as a biological systems researcher for for something called meridian dynamics. Meridian dynamics itself had been dissolved in 1987, but corporate records showed it had been a front company for military biological research. Most of the scientists who'd worked there had scattered to universities and private research facilities across the country, but Elena Vasquez had done something unusual. She'd gone completely off the grid. It took digging through property records, cross-referencing utility connections, and following a trail of carefully obscured financial transactions. But Levi eventually found her living under the name Elena Rodriguez in a small cabin outside Durango, Colorado, about 4 hours south of his ranch. The drive gave him time to think and to notice the changes that were accelerating in his body. His vision was sharper now, especially at night, and he could hear conversations from vehicles several cars away when he stopped for gas. Most unsettling of all, he'd started to sense the emotional states of people around him. Their fear, anger, or deception seemed to radiate from them like heat signatures. Elena's cabin was set back from the road, hidden among stands of aspen and pine that provided natural camouflage. Levi might have driven past it entirely, if not for the subtle signs of habitation solar panels cleverly concealed among the trees. A small satellite dish disguised as a dead branch. He parked and approached on foot, noting the sophisticated security system that was nearly invisible, but clearly designed to detect intruders long before they reached the house. Motion sensors, cameras, and what looked like pressure plates were integrated into the landscape so seamlessly that only his enhanced senses allowed him to spot them. "That's far enough," came a voice from the shadows near the cabin. A woman emerged, holding a shotgun with the casual competence of someone who knew how to use it. She appeared to be in her early 60s, with graying hair pulled back and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Dr. Vasquez, I presume. I haven't used that name in 20 years. What do you want?" Levi slowly rolled up his jeans to reveal the circular lesions. "I want to understand what these are, and why people who develop them tend to disappear." Elena's expression changed immediately from wariness to something approaching horror. She lowered the shotgun and stepped closer, studying the marks with the trained eye of someone who'd seen them before. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. "How long?" "Since they appeared? About a week." "And you're still functional? Still thinking clearly?" She looked at him with new interest. "That's unusual. Most subjects experience significant cognitive changes within days of manifestation. Most subjects." Elena gestured toward the cabin. "We need to talk inside. If you're here, it means they know you exist, and this place won't stay safe much longer." The interior of the cabin was a strange combination of rustic mountain retreat and high-tech laboratory. Computer equipment hummed quietly in one corner, while scientific instruments and medical devices were arranged on tables throughout the main room. "I was one of the primary researchers on Project Sentinel," Elena began without preamble. "Biochemistry and genetic modification, specifically focused on creating biological tracking and enhancement systems for military applications." She moved to a file cabinet and pulled out a thick folder filled with research notes and photographs. "The lesions you're carrying aren't just marks. They're colonies of engineered organisms designed to integrate with human tissue and modify cellular function." "Modify how?" "Enhance sensory capability, increased physical strength, accelerated healing, improved cognitive processing." The military wanted to create super soldiers, but they needed a way to track and control them first. Elena spread out a series of photographs showing the progression of lesions on various test subjects. The organisms reproduce within the host, creating a network that interfaces directly with the nervous system. Over time, they begin to influence behavior and thought patterns. Influence how? Increased aggression, reduced empathy, absolute loyalty to designated authority figures. The enhanced subjects become perfect soldiers, stronger, faster, smarter, and completely obedient. Levi felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What happened to the test subjects? The early ones were volunteers from military, special operations. But when the project expanded, they started using civilian populations near the facility. Local people who wouldn't be missed immediately if something went wrong. And things went wrong. Elena nodded grimly. The organisms were more aggressive than we anticipated. Instead of gradual integration, many subjects experienced rapid cellular takeover. Their personalities disappeared entirely within weeks, replaced by something that looked human but wasn't really human anymore. She pulled out another set of photographs, these showing people in military uniforms with the characteristic circular marks. But their eyes were different, cold, predatory, completely lacking the spark of individual consciousness. By 1985, we had created over 200 enhanced subjects, but we'd lost control of the process. The organisms were evolving, becoming more sophisticated. Some subjects retained their intelligence and personality while gaining the enhancements, but others became something closer to biological machines. What happened to the project? Officially, it was shut down after a containment breach that killed several researchers. Unofficially, it was moved to a more secure location and given better funding. The military had seen what was possible. They weren't going to abandon that kind of potential. Levi thought about Jake's warning regarding Phase 2. It never really ended, did it? No. They learned to be more careful, more patient. Instead of mass testing, they began long-term monitoring of contaminated areas, allowing the organisms to spread naturally through environmental contact. Much lower detection risk, and it gave them a steady supply of new subjects to study. Elena moved to her computer and pulled up a map that looked familiar. It was the same area around the Wyoming facility, but with additional markings that showed contamination zones extending much further than the original survey. They've been slowly expanding the affected area for decades. A fence post here, some buried equipment there, contaminated runoff from old storage sites. The organisms are remarkably persistent in the right conditions. How many people are we talking about? Hundreds, maybe thousands over the years. Most develop mild symptoms and are monitored remotely, but the ones who show strong integration, like you're showing, get collected for more intensive study. The word collected sent a chill through Levi. What happens during collection? Elena's face went pale. I don't know for certain. I left. The project before that phase was fully implemented. But based on the research protocols we were developing, collected subjects were to be used for advanced testing and ultimately deployment in classified military operations. Deployment? Think about it. Super soldiers who can't be traced back to official military units, who possess capabilities that seem impossible, who follow orders without question. Perfect for operations that need complete deniability. Levi was beginning to understand the true scope of the conspiracy. This wasn't just about human experimentation. It was about creating an army of enhanced soldiers who could operate in complete secrecy. Is there a way to reverse the process? Elena was quiet for a long moment. I've been working on that question for 20 years. The short answer is that I don't know. The organisms integrate so completely with human tissue that removing them might not be possible without killing the host. But you're still researching it. I'm trying. But I'm one person working with limited resources, trying to undo something that took hundreds of researchers and unlimited funding to create. She handed him a small device that looked like a modified cell phone. This will let you communicate with me securely. If your condition changes, if you notice new symptoms or abilities, I need to know about it. There's something else, Levi said. I think they're still actively monitoring the area. People have been watching my family's ranch, following me. Elena's expression grew more troubled. Then, you need to be very careful. If they suspect you're investigating the project, they'll move to collect you immediately. And once you're in their custody, You won't be coming back." As Levi prepared to leave, Elena grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Listen to me carefully. The enhancements you're developing, use them, but don't let them define you. I've seen too many good people lose themselves to the organism's influence. Stay connected to who you were before this started, no matter what capabilities you gain." The drive back to Wyoming felt different now. Levi's enhanced senses picked up details he'd never noticed before, the subtle variations in engine, sounds that indicated different vehicle types, the way headlights in his rearview mirror moved in patterns that suggested coordination rather than random traffic. He was being followed by at least 3 vehicles, maintaining careful distances, but clearly working together. They knew where he'd been, and they probably knew what he'd learned. The game was entering a new phase, and the stakes were higher than he'd imagined. But now he had something he hadn't possessed before: knowledge of what he was becoming, and an ally who understood the science behind the conspiracy. The question was whether that would be enough to survive what was coming next. Elena's secure communication device buzzed at 3 in the morning, pulling Levi from restless sleep filled with dreams of circular patterns and shadowy figures watching from the hills. The message was brief but urgent. "Got the blueprints. Much worse than we thought. Need to meet." 2 days later, they met at an abandoned gas station 40 miles from Levi's ranch, a location Elena had scouted for surveillance equipment and found clean. She arrived carrying a metal briefcase that looked like it had been designed to survive a nuclear explosion. "These took considerable risk to acquire," she said, opening the case to reveal a complete set of architectural plans. The original facility. Blueprints, including all the classified sections that never appeared in public records. Levi studied the documents with growing amazement and horror. The surface buildings he'd always seen were merely the tip of an iceberg. Below ground stretched a complex that extended nearly a mile in each direction, with multiple levels descending at least 300 feet into the bedrock. "This is enormous," he said. "How did they build something this size without the whole county knowing about it?" Construction happened in phases over several years, officially classified as deep geological research. Most of the local contractors only worked on small sections, so nobody had a complete picture of what was being built. Elena pointed to a section marked Level 7 Containment and Processing. "This is what concerns me most. According to these plans, the facility has holding areas for up to 500 subjects, plus medical facilities that could support long-term biological modification programs." 500 people? In a facility that's supposedly been abandoned for 30 years. That's what the public believes. But look at these utility connections. She indicated a complex network of power lines, water systems, and communication cables. This facility is still fully operational. They've just gotten better at hiding it. The blueprints showed ventilation systems that were far more sophisticated than necessary for an abandoned building. Security measures that included multiple redundant systems and what appeared to be a private transportation network connecting the facility to sites across the region. "Elena, look at this." Levi had found a section marked Collection Protocols, Phase 2 Implementation. The details were chilling. Systematic contamination schedules, subject monitoring procedures, and harvesting operations designed to provide a steady supply of enhanced individuals without triggering public awareness. "They're not just conducting experiments anymore," Elena said quietly. "They're manufacturing enhanced soldiers on an industrial scale." The blueprints included a timeline that showed the project's evolution from the experimental phase of the 1980s to the current operational phase. What had started as a small-scale research project had grown into something that looked suspiciously like a parallel military force. "How many enhanced subjects do you think they have now?" Levi asked. "Based on these capacity specifications and the timeline, potentially thousands. And if they've solved the control problems we were struggling with in the 80s, those subjects could be deployed anywhere in the world without anyone knowing they're not entirely human. Levi felt his enhanced senses picking up something that made him look up from the blueprints. In the distance, barely visible through the heat shimmer rising from the abandoned asphalt, vehicles were approaching from multiple directions. "We've got company," he said, his voice carrying the calm intensity that had become characteristic since his transformation began. Elena followed his gaze and immediately began packing the blueprints. How many? At least 6 vehicles. They've been coordinating this approach for several minutes. His enhanced hearing was picking up radio chatter from distances that should have been impossible. Military tactical frequencies. "They're not planning to take us alive." "There's something else you need to know," Elena said as they moved quickly toward their vehicles. "The organisms in your system, they're not just enhancing your capabilities. They're preparing you. Preparing me for what? Integration into their operational structure. The enhanced subjects don't just gain super soldier abilities. They develop a form of biological networking that allows for coordinated action without traditional communication methods." Levi felt a chill of understanding. "You mean they share thoughts?" "Something like that. A collective consciousness that makes them incredibly effective as a unit. But it also means individual personality and free will gradually disappear." The approaching vehicles were close enough now that Levi could count them precisely without using binoculars. 6 black SUVs moving in a coordinated pattern designed to cut off all escape routes from the abandoned gas station. "Elena, I need you to get out of here. Take the blueprints and find a way to expose this publicly. What about you?" Levi was surprised to realize that he felt no fear, only a cold calculation of tactical possibilities. His enhanced senses were providing him with detailed information about the approaching threat vehicle speeds, likely crew sizes, probable weapons configurations. "I'm going to find out just how enhanced I've become," he said. Elena looked at him with concern. "Be careful. The enhanced capabilities come with psychological changes. Don't lose yourself to them." She drove away just as the first SUV came into view, leaving Levi alone at the abandoned gas station with nothing but his truck and whatever abilities the bristiques, the organisms in his bloodstream, had given him. The vehicles surrounded the station in a precise tactical formation that spoke of military training and extensive planning. Armed figures emerged from each SUV, moving with mechanical precision toward his position. Even at a distance, Levi could see that something was wrong with them. Their movements were too coordinated, too synchronized, as if they were all responding to the same invisible conductor. Enhanced subjects. They were sending other enhanced subjects to collect him. As the figures approached, Levi noticed the circular lesions on their exposed skin, but these were different from his own. Darker, more extensive, covering larger areas of their bodies. These people had been fully integrated into whatever collective system Elena had described. "Levi Harlan," one of them called out, his voice carrying an odd harmonic quality. "You need to come with us. The integration process is incomplete." "I'll pass," Levi replied, surprised at how calm he felt despite being outnumbered 12-1. "Resistance is not optimal," another figure said, and Levi realized they were all speaking in the same tone, the same cadence. Individual personalities had indeed been erased. What happened next surprised everyone involved, including Levi himself. His enhanced reflexes allowed him to move faster than should have been humanly possible, crossing the 30 yards between his truck and the nearest enhanced subject before the figure could react. His increased strength let him disable the man with a single precise blow that would have been beyond his capabilities just weeks earlier. The most remarkable was the tactical awareness that seemed to flow through his mind like water. He could sense the positions and intentions of all 12 attackers simultaneously, could predict their movements, and coordinate his responses with mathematical precision. The fight lasted less than 3 minutes. When it was over, 6 enhanced subjects were unconscious. 3 were seriously injured, and the remaining 3 had retreated to their vehicles and were calling for reinforcements. Levi stood among the fallen figures, his hands steady and his breathing barely elevated, trying to understand what had just happened. The organisms in his system hadn't just enhanced his physical capabilities. They'd given him access to combat skills and tactical knowledge he'd never possessed. But unlike the subjects who'd attacked him, he was still himself. Still thinking his own thoughts, still feeling his own emotions. Whatever Elena had done in her research notes was working. He was gaining the enhancements without losing his individuality. The secure communication device buzzed with a message from Elena. Whatever happens, don't let them take you to the facility. Based on the blueprints, nobody who goes in there comes out the same person they were. As Levi drove away from the abandoned gas station, he realized the game had changed completely. They weren't just monitoring him anymore. They were actively trying to collect him. And they were willing to use other enhanced subjects to do it. But they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed he would be like the others, powerful but controllable, enhanced but ultimately programmable. Instead, they had created something they hadn't anticipated, an enhanced subject who retained his free will and was now fully aware of their operations. The hunters had indeed marked the wrong prey. The audio recording device was hidden exactly where Tommy Garrett's map had indicated, behind the old furnace in what remained of his buried cellar, wrapped in plastic and sealed in a metal container that had protected it from decades of moisture and decay. Levitt had waited until the darkest hour of night to make his way to the coordinates Tommy had marked, using his enhanced night vision to navigate the unmarked terrain where Tommy's homestead had once stood. The government bulldozers had done their work thoroughly, but they'd missed the cellar's back section, which had been concealed behind a false wall that Tommy had built himself. Now, sitting in his truck a safe distance from the site, Levi plugged the device into his phone and listened to Tommy Garrett's voice speaking from beyond the grave. The recording started with the calm, measured tone of a man documenting evidence for posterity. This is Tommy Garrett, November 30th, 1984. If someone is hearing this, it means they got to me before I could expose what I'd discovered. I want the truth to survive, even if I don't. Tommy's voice was steady, but Levi could hear the underlying tension of a man who knew he was running out of time. The lesions appeared on my cattle first, then on me. Doc Morrison told me it was some kind of contamination from the government facility, but that was only part of the truth. I've been watching that place for months now, and what I've seen has made me realize the scope of what we're dealing with. There was a pause in the recording, the sound of papers rustling. They didn't shut down the project in '85 like they claimed. They relocated it underground, expanded it, and they've been using it to create something that goes way beyond enhanced. Soldiers. I've seen the transport vehicles, the supply shipments, the personnel rotations. This isn't a research facility, it's a production facility. Levi felt his enhanced senses picking up approaching vehicles in the distance. But Tommy's next words made him forget about the immediate danger. But that's not the worst part. I figured out why they chose this location, why they built the facility. Here, specifically. It wasn't random, and it wasn't just because the land was cheap and isolated. Tommy's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. My father was part of the original project. Not as a subject, as a planner. He helped them select the site, helped them identify the local families who would be suitable for long-term monitoring. The Garretts, the Harmons, the Brennans, all the old ranching families in this area were chosen deliberately. Levi's blood turned to ice. Tommy was listing the founding families of the county, including his own. They wanted subjects with specific genetic markers, people whose families had been isolated in this area for generations. They weren't just contaminating us randomly, they were breeding us, selecting bloodlines that would respond optimally to their organisms. The recording crackled with static, but Tommy's voice continued. My father kept records, maps showing which families carried the genetic markers they wanted. The Harlans were at the top of the list. Jim Harlan's grandfather was one of the original subjects in a pilot program that ran from 1952 to 1960. Jim himself was monitored from birth. Levi's hands began to shake as the implications sank in. His family had been part of this conspiracy for 3 generations. Jim Harlan was never supposed to know about his father's involvement, but the genetic modifications were passed down. That's why they built the facility so close to the Harlan Ranch. They've been watching that family for 70 years, waiting for the right generation to show optimal integration characteristics. The vehicles Levi had heard earlier were getting closer, but he couldn't move. Tommy's revelation had frozen him in place. I confronted Doc Morrison about this 2 days ago. He broke down and told me everything. The project never ended because it was working exactly as designed. They weren't just creating enhanced soldiers. They were creating a new subspecies of human beings. And they've been using our families as unwitting breeding stock for decades. There was a long pause, then Tommy's voice resumed with even greater urgency. Morrison is more than just a complicit observer. He's been reporting on marked subjects for 30 years. But he's also been following genetic guidelines for recommended breeding pairs. He's been manipulating local relationships, encouraging marriages between specific bloodlines, all to produce the next generation of optimal subjects. Levi thought about his father's marriage to his mother, about the family histories that had seemed like simple rural coincidences, but now appeared to follow patterns that had been carefully orchestrated. The enhanced subjects they collect aren't being turned into soldiers. They're being turned into breeding stock for the next phase of the project. They're planning to replace the entire human population of this region with enhanced individuals who shared a collective consciousness, Elena described. The audio quality deteriorated slightly, but Tommy's final words came through clearly. If you're listening to this, you need to know that resistance is possible. The organisms can be fought if you understand what you're fighting. But first, you have to accept that everything you thought you knew about your family history is a lie. We're not victims of random contamination. We're products of a genetic engineering program that started before most of us were born. The recording ended with the sound of vehicles approaching and Tommy's voice saying, "They're here. I'm going to try to run, but if I don't make it, remember, the truth is in Morrison's records." He's kept documentation of everything, including the genetic maps and breeding recommendations. It's his insurance policy, and it's the key to exposing the whole operation. Levi sat in stunned silence as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just about military enhancement or even human experimentation. It was about species replacement on a regional scale, with his family serving as the cornerstone bloodline for a new type of human being. The vehicles he'd been tracking were close enough now that he could see their headlights through the trees. But instead of fear, he felt a cold rage building in his chest. Everything about his life, his family's history, even his relationship with the land they'd worked for generations, had been shaped by people who saw them as livestock to be managed and harvested. His enhanced senses picked up radio chatter from the approaching vehicles, and what he heard confirmed Tommy's worst suspicions. They weren't coming to collect him for experimentation. They were coming to bring him in for breeding assessment and integration protocols. But Tommy's recording had given him something invaluable: the knowledge that Doc Morrison had kept records of everything. Detailed documentation that could expose not just the current operation, but 70 years of genetic manipulation and population control. As the vehicle surrounded his position, Levi made a decision that surprised him with its clarity and ruthlessness. He was no longer going to play the role of confused victim stumbling toward the truth. The organisms in his bloodstream had given him capabilities that went far beyond enhanced senses and reflexes. They'd awakened something that understood tactics and strategy on a level that seemed almost instinctual. He was going to hunt the hunters. The enhanced subjects who emerged from the vehicles moved with their characteristic synchronized precision. But this time, Levi was ready for them. More than ready, he was eager to test the full extent of his capabilities against opponents who thought they understood what he was becoming. What they didn't understand was that Tommy Garrett's revelation had changed the fundamental nature of the conflict. This was no longer about preventing his own collection or even exposing a conspiracy. This was about stopping a program designed to replace human beings with controllable substitutes. And his family had been selected to serve as the genetic foundation for that replacement. The enhanced subjects approached his position with mechanical confidence, unaware that their target had just discovered he wasn't a victim. He was a weapon that had been 70 years in the making. And now that weapon was about to turn against its creators. The fight that followed would prove to be just the beginning of a war that had been planned for generations, but would end in ways no one had anticipated. The military communication device Elena had given him crackled to life at 4:47 a.m., with an intercept that made Levi's blood run cold. Collection Team Alpha, this is base. Target designation LH1 is scheduled for extraction at 0800 hours tomorrow. Medical assessment indicates optimal integration period ending. This is Priority 1. Do not allow target to deteriorate beyond harvest viability. Mace, this is Alpha Leader. Target has demonstrated unexpected resistance capabilities. Request. Permission for enhanced suppression protocols. Negative on enhanced suppression. Subject must be collected intact. Genetic profile is too valuable to risk damage. Deploy containment team with sedation protocols only. Levi checked his watch that gave him less than 15 hours before they came for him in force. But more importantly, it confirmed what Tommy Garrett's recording had revealed. He wasn't just another test subject. The designation, LH1, suggested he was the first of something, likely the first of his bloodline to reach optimal integration. Elena's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Monitored all channels. They're mobilizing everything for your collection. At least 50 enhanced subjects plus support personnel. This is their priority operation. He typed back. Can you get inside their communication network? Already in. Sending you access codes. Now. But Levi, what they're planning, it's not just your collection. They're moving to Phase 3. What's Phase 3? Regional expansion. They're going to release aerosol versions of the organisms across 3 states. Create thousands of marked subjects simultaneously. You were supposed to be the proof of concept that the process could produce controllable enhanced individuals. The scope of what they were facing hit Levi like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to continue their gradual contamination. They were preparing to convert entire populations at once. How long before Phase 3 deployment? 72 hours. But only if they can prove the control mechanisms work. With subjects like you. Levi understood now why his collection had become so urgent. If they could demonstrate that even strong-willed enhanced subjects could be integrated into their collective consciousness, nothing would stop them from proceeding with mass conversion. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They assumed that optimal integration meant optimal control. Instead, Levi's genetic profile had produced something they hadn't anticipated, an enhanced subject who could resist their conditioning while retaining all the benefits of the modifications. Alana's next message contained detailed facility schematics and guard rotations. I've been monitoring their communications for 3 days. They're holding 17 other enhanced subjects in the underground complex. All of them are from local bloodlines, all collected within the past year. 17 people. 17 members of the community who'd been disappeared while their families were told they'd moved away or had accidents. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Elena, can the control process be reversed? Unknown. But if we can access the facility's main computer systems, I might be able to upload a virus that disrupts the collective networking. Could give the controlled subjects a chance to regain their individuality. A plan was beginning to form in Levi's mind. Dangerous, but potentially devastating to their operations. If he could infiltrate the facility during his own collection, he might be able to rescue the other subjects and destroy the systems they needed for Phase 3. But it would require perfect timing and help from someone who had access to the facilities. Security Systems. Doc Morrison. The drive to Morrison's house took 20 minutes, during which Levi's enhanced senses picked up multiple surveillance teams maintaining visual contact. They were being careful not to interfere with his movements, probably hoping he would lead them to other members of his support network. Morrison's house was dark when Levi arrived, but his enhanced hearing detected the doctor moving around inside. He knocked once softly and Morrison opened the door immediately, as if he'd been waiting. "I wondered when you come," Morrison said quietly. He looked like he'd aged 10 years since their first meeting, his face gaunt and his eyes carrying the weight of decades of complicity. "Doc, I need to know about the facility, all of it. The security systems, the layout, how to get inside." Morrison gestured him into the living room, where files and documents were spread across every surface. "I've been going through my records since Tommy's recording surfaced, trying to understand the full scope of what I've been part of." "Tommy's recording? They don't know I have a copy. Tommy left it with me 3 days before he disappeared, along with instructions to give it to anyone from the targeted bloodlines who started asking the right questions." Morrison handed him a thick folder. "These are the genetic profiles they've been tracking. 7 families, going back 4 generations. They've been orchestrating marriages, tracking births, monitoring children for optimal genetic markers." The folder contained family trees that looked like breeding charts for livestock. Levi's family line was marked with detailed annotations about genetic compatibility, enhancement potential, and collection timing. "Doc, how do we get inside the facility?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, then walked to a safe hidden behind a bookshelf. Inside was a security card and a small electronic device. "I've had access to the facility for 30 years. They never revoked my clearance because they needed local medical support for their operations. This card will get you through the main security checkpoints, and this device will temporarily disable the surveillance systems in specific areas." "You're helping me break in?" "I'm helping you finish what I should have done 30 years ago." Morrison's voice was filled with quiet determination. "They told me I was protecting the community by monitoring potential subjects. Instead, I've been feeding them to a machine that turns people into programmable weapons." Morrison pulled out another device, a small transmitter. "This will give Elena remote access to the facility's computer network once you're inside. But Levi, you need to understand what you're walking into. The underground complex houses more than just prisoners. They have manufacturing facilities, training areas, and something they call the Integration Center." "What's the Integration Center?" "Where they break the minds of enhanced subjects who resist the collective programming. Psychological conditioning combined with direct neural interface modification. Nobody who goes through integration comes out as the same person." Levi thought about the synchronized movements of the enhanced subjects who tried to collect him. That mechanical precision came at the cost of everything that made them human. How many guards? The facility operates with minimal human personnel. Most of the security is handled by enhanced subjects who've been fully integrated. But they have one weakness: Their collective networking requires central coordination. If that system goes down, they become confused and disorganized. Morrison showed him a map marking the location of the central processing unit. It's housed on level 7 in the heart of the complex. If Elena can upload her virus to that system, it might free all the controlled subjects simultaneously. Might? The conditioning runs deep. Some subjects might be too far gone to recover their original personalities, but it's the only chance they have. As they finalized the plan, Morrison's expression grew increasingly troubled. Levi, there's something else you need to know. The collection schedule isn't random. They're timing your extraction to coincide with a specific biological window. What kind of window? The organisms in your system are preparing for a reproductive phase. Within the next 24 hours, your enhanced genetics will reach peak viability for creating the next generation of subjects. That's why they can't wait any longer to bring you in. The implications were horrifying. They didn't just want to use him as a weapon. They wanted to use him to breed an entire generation of enhanced subjects who would be controllable from birth. The other prisoners in the facility, Levi said. How many are women from compatible bloodlines? Morrison nodded grimly. 14 of the 17. All selected for optimal genetic compatibility with your profile. Levi felt his enhanced senses, picking up approaching vehicles, multiple teams converging on Morrison's house from different directions. His abilities were evolving faster now, giving him tactical awareness that extended far beyond normal human perception. He could track the movement patterns of at least 6 different vehicle groups, all coordinating their approach with military precision. They're coming, he said. 8 minutes out, maybe less. Morrison handed him the access card and the electronic devices with hands that had steadied with purpose. The facility has emergency protocols that will seal all exits if they detect an intrusion. You'll have maybe 30 minutes to complete your mission before the lockdown becomes permanent. What about you? I'll try to buy you time. They still need me for the medical assessments, so they won't eliminate me immediately. But Levi, Morrison gripped his shoulder with surprising strength. If you can't save all of them, save yourself. Don't let them turn you into what they've turned the others into. I'm not leaving anyone behind, Doc. You may not have a choice. The integration center breaks people in ways that can't be undone. Some of those subjects may be too damaged to save, even if you free them from physical captivity. Outside, the sound of vehicles surrounded the house. Levi counted at least 8. Different engines, plus the distinctive whine of surveillance drones overhead. His enhanced hearing was also picking up radio chatter, indicating that collection teams were being deployed to multiple locations simultaneously. They were preparing for the Valayota chatter, indicating that collection teams were being deployed to multiple locations simultaneously. They were preparing for the Maya Score, possibility that he might try to run. But instead of fear, he felt the cold calculation that had become his dominant emotional state since the enhancement began. His mind was already running tactical scenarios, calculating approach routes and timing sequences. The enhanced capabilities weren't just physical. They were giving him strategic, thinking abilities that seemed almost superhuman. Elena's communication device buzzed with one final message. Levi, I've identified the exact location of the master control system. It's not just on level 7. It's in a section that requires dual key access. You'll need Morrison's card, plus one from a facility administrator, to reach the core systems. He showed the message to Morrison, who paled slightly. There's only one administrator currently at the facility. Dr. Marcus Webb. He was one of the original Project Sentinel researchers. He's the one who designed the integration protocols. Can you get me his access card? Not without alerting him to what we're planning. But Levi, Webb isn't just another scientist. He's been enhanced himself, voluntarily. He's retained his intelligence and personality, but gained all the physical capabilities, plus access to the collective network. He's like you, but completely loyal to the project. The vehicles outside had stopped, and Levi could hear tactical teams taking positions around the house. They had maybe 2 minutes before the collection attempt began. "Doc, there has to be another way into the core systems." Morrison thought for a moment, then his face brightened with desperate hope. Emergency override. If the facility's life support systems detect a critical failure, all security locks automatically disengage to allow evacuation. The override is located in the physical plant on level 9. How do I trigger it without killing everyone inside? Controlled. Ventilation failure. The system will register it as life-threatening, but there's a 40-minute safety buffer before actual danger. More than enough time to reach the core systems and upload Elena's virus. As Levi prepared to leave through the back door, Morrison grabbed his arm one final time. "Whatever you've become, Levi, whatever these enhancements have made you capable of, remember who you were before this started. That's the only way to come back from what you're about to face. I'll remember." Outside, tactical lights blazed to life, illuminating the house like a prison yard. Levi counted 12 enhanced subjects in full combat gear, moving with the synchronized precision he'd learned to recognize. But his own capabilities had evolved far enough that their coordination no longer seemed overwhelming, just another tactical challenge to overcome. The final phase of the operation was about to begin, and, for the first time since this started, Levi felt like he had the advantage. They expected him to run, to try to avoid collection. Instead, he was going to walk directly into their most secure facility and tear their operation apart from the inside. The enhanced subjects they'd created to hunt him were about to discover that their perfect weapon had one flaw their designers hadn't anticipated. It had retained enough humanity to choose its own targets. And tonight, those targets included everyone responsible for turning human beings into programmable tools for destruction. The facility's main entrance looked exactly like the blueprints had indicated. A simple concrete structure built into the hillside, designed to appear like nothing more than a utility building. But Levi's enhanced senses picked up the subtle signs of the complex security systems hidden within the mundane facade. Morrison's access card worked perfectly, opening the reinforced steel door with a soft electronic chime. The corridor beyond stretched into darkness, lit only by emergency lighting that cast everything in an eerie red glow. Levi moved quickly but carefully through the entry level, following the route Elena had mapped out based on the facility schematics. The electronic device Morrison had given him disabled surveillance cameras in 15-second intervals, enough time to pass each checkpoint without being detected, but requiring precise timing. The elevator descended much further than he'd expected, even knowing the facility extended deep underground. Level after level passed by until finally stopping at level 7, where the blueprints indicated the prisoners were being held. The doors opened onto a corridor that looked more like a hospital than a military facility. Clean white walls, polished floors, and the antiseptic smell of medical equipment filled the air. But underneath the clinical appearance, Levi's enhanced hearing picked up sounds that made his blood boil. The soft conversations of guards, discussing subjects like livestock, the electronic hum of monitoring equipment, and from somewhere deeper in the complex, the rhythmic chanting that suggested group programming sessions. He found the first holding area exactly where the blueprints indicated. Through the reinforced window, he could see a figure sitting motionless on a narrow bed, staring at the wall with the blank expression he'd learned to associate with fully integrated subjects. But this person was different. As Levi watched, the figure turned toward the window, and he saw recognition flicker in eyes that weren't completely empty. This subject was fighting the conditioning, maintaining some core of individual consciousness despite whatever they'd been subjected to. Using Morrison's override codes, Levi opened the cell door. The figure inside was a woman in her 30s, wearing the plain gray uniform that all the subjects had been given. When she saw him, she tried to speak, but could only manage a whisper. "Tommy," she said, her voice filled with desperate hope. "Tommy sent you?" Levi realized he was looking at Sarah Martinez, a local rancher who disappeared 6 months ago. Her family had been told she'd moved to Denver for medical treatment. "My name is Levi. I'm here to get you out." Sarah tried to stand but stumbled, the conditioning making coordinated movement difficult when she wasn't following programmed instructions. "The others," she whispered. "They're in the integration center. They're trying to break the ones who won't submit." Levi helped her to the corridor, then continued methodically opening cells. Most of the subjects he found were in various stages of integration, some completely unresponsive, others clinging to fragments of their original personalities. But as he worked his way through the holding area, a familiar voice made him freeze. Well, Levi Harlan finally comes home. He turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows at the end of the corridor. It took him a moment to recognize the man as Tommy Garrett, but this wasn't the person described in Jake's stories. Tommy's eyes held the cold, mechanical intelligence of a fully integrated subject, and the circular lesions covering his arms and neck were so extensive they looked like decorative patterns. "Tommy Garrett, I presume. Jake said you disappeared. I was collected, just like you're about to be. But instead of fighting the process, I embraced it. Do you have any idea what they've made us capable of?" Tommy moved with the fluid precision Levi had learned to associate with enhanced subjects. But there was something different about his movements. More controlled, more purposeful than the others he'd encountered. "They didn't just enhance me, Levi. They promoted me. I'm the field commander for enhanced operations now. My job is to manage subjects who show resistance to integration, meaning you break people who won't cooperate. I help them understand that resistance is fuel and cooperation offers advantages they can't imagine." Tommy's voice carried the harmonic quality of the collective, but underneath it, Levi detected something else. A harmonic quality of the collectives, but underneath it, Levi detected something else. A harmonic quality of the detected something else. A core of the original personality that was still present, but had chosen to collaborate. "The integration center isn't about destroying consciousness," Tommy continued. "It's about expanding it. When you stop fighting the collective network, you gain access to the knowledge and capabilities of hundreds of enhanced individuals. Why? Would you want to remain limited to just your own mind?" Behind Tommy, more figures emerged from the shadows, enhanced subjects who moved with perfect coordination, surrounding Levi's position with military precision. "You can't save them," Tommy said, gesturing to the partially freed subjects who were cowering behind Levi. "They're already part of the system. Even if you took them away from here, they'd eventually return on their own. The conditioning creates a need for the collective that becomes stronger than any individual desire for freedom." Levi felt the electronic device Elena had given him vibrating in his pocket, a signal that she'd successfully infiltrated the facility's computer network and was beginning to upload the virus that would disrupt the collective systems. "Maybe," Levi said, calculating the distance to the nearest emergency exit. "But I'm going to give them the chance to find out." What happened next unfolded with the kind of precise violence that his enhanced capabilities had been designed for. But unlike the other confrontations he'd experienced, this fight wasn't about overpowering opponents. It was about buying time for Elena's virus to propagate through the system. Tommy and his team moved with coordinated precision, but their collective networking also meant they were vulnerable to the same disruption that would hopefully free the other subjects. As Elena's virus began to take effect, their movements became less synchronized, creating openings that Levi exploited with ruthless efficiency. The battle for the facility's heart was about to begin, and everything depended on whether Elena's disruption program could break decades of psychological conditioning before Levi was overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Elena's virus worked faster than anyone had anticipated. The collective network that bound the enhanced subjects together began failing in cascading waves, starting with the newest subjects and working its way up to those who'd been integrated longest. Levi watched Tommy Garrett's coordinated team suddenly stumble and look around in confusion as the harmonic voices in their heads went silent for the first time in years. But the virus had an unexpected side effect. It didn't just disrupt the collective consciousness. It began awakening suppressed memories and personalities that had been buried under layers of conditioning. Tommy himself was the most dramatic example. As the network failed, his mechanical precision dissolved into something approaching panic. For the first time since his integration, he was alone in his own mind, and the horror of what he'd become was written clearly across his face. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. "What have I done? What did they make me do?" Around the corridor, other enhanced subjects were experiencing similar awakenings. Some collapsed to their knees, overwhelmed by the return of suppressed emotions. Others stood frozen, trying to process years of memories that had been locked away. But Elena's voice crackled through the communication device with urgent warning. "Levi, the virus is working too well. The facility's automated systems are detecting the network failure and initiating emergency protocols." Red lights began flashing throughout the complex, and automated announcements echoed through the corridors. "Containment breach detected. Initiating lockdown procedures. All personnel report to designated safe areas." Heavy blast doors began sliding shut throughout the facility, designed to prevent any contaminated subjects from escaping if the biological containment systems failed. They had maybe 5 minutes before the entire complex would be sealed permanently. "Tommy," Levi called out to the confused former commander, "how do we get everyone out of here?" Tommy looked up with eyes that were now fully human, filled with guilt and desperate determination. "The emergency evacuation routes. Level 9 has direct access to the surface through the old mine shafts. But we have to reach the master control system first. If lockdown completes, those shafts will be sealed with explosive charges." As they helped the freed subjects move toward the emergency exits, Tommy explained what he remembered from his years as a field commander. "The control system is in the central processing unit, but it's defended by the facility's most advanced subjects, the ones who've been enhanced beyond normal human capabilities." "How enhanced?" "Think of what you can do now, then multiply it by 10. They've been modified so extensively that they're barely recognizable as human anymore. They reached the master control room just as the facility's ultimate guardians emerged from hidden alcoves. These weren't enhanced humans. They were something entirely new, creatures that moved with impossible speed and possessed strength that could tear through steel barriers. But Elena's virus had given Levi and the other freed subjects an unexpected advantage. As the collective network continued to fail, these ultimate guardians began experiencing the same confusion and disorientation that had affected the others. The battle for the control system was unlike anything Levi had experienced. His enhanced capabilities were pushed to their absolute limits as he fought opponents who possessed advantages he couldn't match through physical prowess alone. But the virus had leveled the playing field by removing their coordination and shared tactical awareness. Working together, Levi and Tommy managed to reach the central processing unit while the other freed subjects held off the remaining guardians. Elena's voice guided them through the complex shutdown, procedures that would permanently disable the facility's biological research programs. "Uploading the final data package now," Elena reported. "This contains everything. All the research, files, subject records, genetic profiles, and documentation of the broader conspiracy. Once this hits the internet, They won't be able to cover this up. As the master control system shut down, the facility's lockdown procedures were overridden. Emergency blast doors opened throughout the complex, and the automated systems that had been preparing to seal the facility permanently went silent. But Tommy grabbed Levi's arm with urgent intensity. This facility is just one node in a much larger network. There are at least 12 other sites across the country, all connected through encrypted communication systems. Shutting down this location won't stop the broader program. Then we make sure the evidence Elena collected exposes all of them. As they led the freed subjects through the emergency evacuation routes toward the surface, Levi realized that Tommy's sacrifice had been the key to their success. His years as a field commander had given him knowledge of the facility's weaknesses that no outside infiltrator could have possessed. "Tommy, what you did down there doesn't make up for the people I hurt while I was under their control," Tommy replied quietly, "but maybe it's a start." They emerged from the abandoned mine shaft just as the first news helicopters appeared on the horizon. Elena's data package had already begun spreading across the internet, and the story was breaking simultaneously on every major news network. The facility that had operated in secrecy for decades was about to become the center of the biggest government conspiracy scandal in modern history. But more importantly, 17 people who'd been written off as missing were walking free under the Wyoming sky. The immediate battle was over, but Levi knew the war was just beginning. Somewhere out there, 11 other facilities were continuing the same research, creating more enhanced subjects and preparing for the next phase of their plan to replace human consciousness with programmable alternatives. But now they had something they'd never had before: proof of what was being done, and enhanced subjects who'd retained their humanity to fight back. 6 months after the facility was shut down, Levi stood in the witness box of the Senate Intelligence Committee's hearing room, looking out at an audience that included families of the disappeared, investigative journalists, and government officials, who were finally being held accountable for decades of illegal human experimentation. The congressional investigation report that had been published 3 weeks earlier ran to over 800 pages, documenting not just Project Sentinel, but a web of related programs that had been operating in secret for nearly 70 years. Elena's data package had provided the evidence, but it had taken months of testimony from freed subjects to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy. "Mr. Harlan," the committee chairman asked, "in your opinion, could this program have continued indefinitely without detection if you hadn't been contaminated by that barbed wire?" Levi considered the question carefully. "Senator, I think they made one critical miscalculation. They assumed that enhanced subjects would eventually lose their humanity, that the modifications would make us more controllable rather than more capable of resistance. They didn't account for the possibility that their enhancements might make us better at fighting back." In the gallery, he could see familiar faces: Tawny Garrett, who'd become the most important witness in exposing the program's operational details; Elena, who'd been granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation; and his father, Jim, whose own family history had finally been revealed through the investigation. The hearings had been difficult for everyone involved, but especially for the freed subjects who were still dealing with the psychological effects of their conditioning. Some had recovered completely, their original personalities intact. Others, like Sarah Martinez, were still struggling with memory gaps and the lingering effects of the collective programming. Doc Morrison had not survived to see justice done. 3 days after helping Levi infiltrate the facility, he'd been found dead in his office, officially ruled a heart attack but widely believed to have been silenced before he could provide testimony. His hidden records, however, had become crucial evidence in the investigation. "Mr. Harlan," another senator asked, "what is your current physical condition? Are you still experiencing the enhancements that resulted from your contamination?" "Yes, Senator. Elena Dr. Vasquez has determined that complete removal of the organisms isn't medically feasible. But I've learned to manage the enhancements without losing my individuality. Without that individuality. It's become part of who I am now. That was the truth, though not the complete truth. His enhanced capabilities had actually grown stronger over time, but unlike the facility's subjects, he'd retained complete control over them. He could see and hear things that normal humans couldn't, could move with speed and strength that went beyond natural limits. But he was still fundamentally himself. Elena had theorized that his genetic profile, the same characteristics that had made him valuable to the program, had also made him uniquely resistant to their control mechanisms, whatever his family's bloodline contained. It apparently produced enhanced subjects who couldn't be turned into programmable weapons. What are your plans now, Mr. Harlan? Levi looked out at the audience again, seeing faces of people whose lives have been forever changed by the conspiracy. I'm returning to my ranch, Senator, but I'm also working with Dr. Vasquez and other survivors to help locate and shut down the remaining facilities. The investigation has confirmed that 11 other sites are still operational, and we estimate they're holding hundreds of subjects who deserve the same chance at freedom that we had. The committee chairman nodded approvingly. The Department of Justice has assured us that those facilities will be located and shut down within the year. After the hearing, Levi walked outside into the crisp Washington air, where Elena was waiting with the latest intelligence reports. Despite being in her 60s, she'd thrown herself into the work of tracking down the remaining facilities with the energy of someone who'd finally found a way to atone for past mistakes. 3 more sites confirmed, she said, handing him a folder. 1 in Nevada, 1 in Montana, and 1 in Northern California. All using the same operational patterns we documented in Wyoming. How many subjects? Best estimates suggest around 40 per facility. Mix of voluntary military subjects and civilians who were contaminated through environmental exposure. Tommy Garrett joined them, carrying his own set of files. His transformation from field commander back to the person he'd been before integration had been remarkable, though he still carried the guilt of actions he'd taken while under their control. The Nevada facility looks like our best target, Tommy said. Smaller security footprint, and I have contacts among the enhanced guards there from my operational days. Some of them might be willing to help if they knew freedom was possible. As they walked toward their rental car, Levi reflected on how much had changed since that morning when he'd scraped his leg on contaminated barbed wire. The simple injury that should have healed in a few days had exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and military command. But more than that, it had revealed something about the nature of human consciousness that the conspirators had fundamentally misunderstood. They'd assumed that enhanced capabilities would make people easier to control, that subjects would trade their individuality for power and belonging. Instead, at least some subjects became more human, not less, more determined to protect their freedom, more capable of fighting for others who couldn't fight for themselves. The drive back to Wyoming took them through landscapes that had been contaminated by decades of secret programs, but also through communities that were finally beginning to heal now that the truth was known. Families had closure about missing relatives. Environmental cleanup efforts were beginning in affected areas. And most importantly, the survivors were building new lives with the knowledge that their sacrifices had prevented something much worse from happening. Levi's ranch looked exactly the same as it had 6 months earlier, but everything about his relationship with the land had changed. He now knew the history of his family's bloodline, understood why they'd been selected for the program, and carried the responsibility of ensuring that future generations would never face the same. Manipulation dawned as he stood on his porch watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and amber. Levi felt the enhanced organisms in his bloodstream pulsing with their familiar rhythm. They were part of him now, would always be part of him, but they hadn't cost him his humanity. If anything, they'd shown him what it truly meant to be human, to choose compassion over control, freedom over power, and individual consciousness over collective obedience. The conspiracy had been exposed. The facilities would be shut down, and the subjects would be freed. But the most important victory was proving that no amount of enhancement or conditioning could erase the fundamental human capacity to choose who you wanted to be. Some wounds, Levi had learned, don't just heal. They transform you into something stronger than you were before.